Welcome back. Were the breakout sessions what you wanted? Did it do it for you? Pretty interesting. Ours, the yellow color was very good. I thought we had a good conversation. We had a good one. I think one thing that we need more of, we need more Frank Mullers, we need more farmers, we need, we were just talking up here, I think the State Board of Food and Agriculture in California needs to be here. I hope that this institute reaches out to more of us. I've always said that as we hurl towards that 9 billion global population at what, 125,000 people a day, it's going to take all of agriculture to feed us. And I happen to be an organic grower. I totally believe in sustainable agriculture, and it's going to take our conventional growers also reaching out. It's going to take small, urban edge, infill, large, and they need to be part of this future institute. So this afternoon, our panel is going to be focusing on the key challenges and opportunities in changing research and policy across the food system. And we have a great group of people here. So please welcome all of us. And my first panelist is June Boras. And June is a political activist and academic. He has been deeply involved in rural social movements in the Philippines and internationally since the 1980s. He has written extensively on land issues and agrarian movements. He is a fellow at Food First and the coordinator for initiatives in critical agrarian studies. Please welcome June. Tracy McMillan is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The American Way of Eating, Undercover at Walmart, Applebee's, Farm Fields, and the Dinner Table. She has written extensively a variety of publications for the New York Times and the Washington Post, winning recognition for the James Beard Foundation and Why Hunger. In 2013, she was named the Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow at the University of Michigan, shortly after being named a Senior Fellow at the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism. Please welcome Tracy. Tracy, welcome. Ernesto Mendez is a native of El Salvador. He has 15 years of research experience working with smallholder farmers. And I looked that up, Ernesto, and I believe it is smaller, self-sufficient farmers throughout Mexico and Central America. He is currently an associate professor with the environmental program and the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences at the University of Vermont. His recent projects have focused on food sovereignty of coffee farmers and cooperatives. He serves on many boards, including the Community Agroecology Network and the Conservation Research Foundation. Welcome, Ernesto. Beginning her work as a volunteer with the Ventura County Living Wage Coalition, Marisela Morales worked on a variety of issues ranging from living wage, health coverage for the uninsured, women's economic justice, green economy, and local hire projects. Being the co-chair of the California Roots of Change Stewardship Council, she has provided leadership in the mission of helping to create a sustainable food system in California. She currently is the Deputy Executive Director of the Central Coast Alliance, United for a Sustainable Economy. Please welcome Marisela. With degrees from the University of Minnesota, Princeton, and Dartmouth, Dr. David Wallenga received the William T. Grant Foundation Distinguished Fellow in Food Systems and Public Health. He is known for taking a complete systems approach to the health impacts of food, how it is processed, packaged, and distributed in today's global industrialized system. He is currently the Senior Advisor in Science, Food, and Health at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Please welcome David. Okay, so it's my favorite question, and that is just to get us going after that great lunch, and so you don't taper off into a slumber here. June, what are you up to? What's going on? What's top of your list? What can we learn? What's the takeaway? What's positive in the food system in your life?
I thought you would say, what's exciting?
What's exciting?
Well, I'm a little bit out of place here because I don't work on U.S. issues, and I don't work directly on food issues. My work is more on global land grabs in different regions of the world, and how these are linked to what I call the rise of flex crops, crops that have multiple and flexible uses. It can be used for when you plant oil palm, you don't know what it's going to be, whether it would end up in your Kit Kat chocolate or in your shampoo this morning or as a fuel for your car. You don't know. But land grabs worldwide are actually associated with the rise of these flex crops. Sugarcane for ethanol and for cane for our coffee, oil palm, soya, and all these things, and even what I call a flex forests. Forest for industrial trees is actually one of the most important expansions in terms of land use change worldwide today, but it can also be for pulp, but it can also be speculating for possible carbon sequestration investment. So these are all the things, and I'm working on that. Nothing exciting and nothing positive. It's very depressing. When you do field work in Cambodia, where people are just like treated like chicken and they are being expelled from their lands, often violently, you don't really get excited in positive sense in that. You get angry. It's depressing, and that's where I work. I wanted to be excited by more resistance, but there are. But we wish there are more resistance acts.
June, this arena of flex crops, and thank you for introducing that. It's a new concept to me. Is it in itself a positive situation?
It's very much associated with the with the expansion of industrial agriculture. Right. So that it also tells us about the interconnections in the global food system. Yeah. So I won't say very much, well, it depends. Is it a positive thing? Well, it depends on who controls the technology and who controls the entire production, circulation, and consumption process in the end.
Okay.
Per se, it's not bad.
Yeah, good. I'm sure we'll come back to that. Tracy, what's on your docket? What's exciting you? What are you into in the next couple of months?
Yeah, well, I come here as a journalist, and so my focus isn't just food, but more about holding people in power accountable. And I find food is just a really rich narrative and resource to do that. So as an author and journalist, mostly concerned with low-income and working-class communities, I'm going to be looking at issues of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, which means I'm going to be able to broaden my scope a little bit outside of the U.S. Food sovereignty, right, is a concept that's probably a little more familiar outside of here, but I'm going to be looking to do more reporting in sort of Detroit and the South and sort of parts of the U.S. that are really experiencing an exploration of food sovereignty. Will
that come in the form of articles or a more feature-length book? What do you think?
Probably aimed towards a book in general, but the way it works, right, is you often work on pieces that feed into a book project later. So, I mean, I'm not going to tie myself to one format or the other.
And we won't keep you to it either.
Thank you.
And Ernesto, how about you? What are you engaged in today that's...
So I did write a little bit here, but what's really exciting is that I'm going on sabbatical in August.
That's very good.
It's really exciting.
Everybody in this room can relate to that, this university.
Work-wise, I think last year I started with a group of colleagues a project in Vermont called the Vermont Agricultural Resilience in a Changing Climate Initiative. And it's... has a transdisciplinary approach and a participatory action research approach. It's also very challenging. I shared with my breakout group how it's been great that we can launch it, calling it already a transdisciplinary project with participation and action in it, but bringing people together. We have 8 research faculty from the fields of agroecology, economics, public policy, climate science, 2 extension teams that work very closely with farmers, and an advisory group with at least, I think, 6 farmers. So it's a very ambitious project, and it just as it is exciting, it is challenging. But I'm really happy that it got off the ground, and
Great.
We've been at it for a year, and hopefully we'll continue in the long term.
Well, congratulations. I look forward to keeping up on that and getting reports back from you on that one. Marcelo, how about you? What are you engaged in? you're excited about?
A lot, and I think that cause, I was thinking about how cause and the Institute have, things in common, and for cause, there are at least four key components to our work. Our mission is social, economic, and environmental justice, and so it's very broad. Food justice falls into that. Labor, justice falls into that. And research has always been at its core, social movement building in terms of community organizing and diverse multiracial coalition building, institution building. When we started a dozen years ago, we had no social capital. There was no institution to hang our hat on. And at this point, we've been able to transform our Ventura County and Santa Barbara County region on behalf of working families, including farm workers. And this is in what we call sort of the shadow of the Ronald Reagan Library in Simi Valley, where the Rodney King trials happened. It is not a liberal territory. And I think that if we can do it in Ventura and Santa Barbara County, then I think that this institute for Berkeley can make justice be at its core. What we're working on right now that very much is tied to food justice is the immigration reform. And so, that's something that whether at whatever, point in the food chain you are, whether you're producing it or whether you're consuming it, you're going to be affected by that immigration system. There's 11 million people who are undocumented, and many of those are food system workers. But it also, our work is also tying on other issues that, may not seem, directly tied to the food movement, and yet are. One of the nexus points that I think we need more research on is the nexus between labor and community. So when you have in the Central Valley and in the Central Coast entire communities that are almost 100% farm worker communities, under almost 100% Latino, immigrant, then their working conditions very much have a direct impact on their living conditions. So it's not just an either or. We either take care of their community or we take care of them at the job. They're very much integrated. And so as an example, at the grassroots level, community of Santa Maria, parents are fingerprinted if they just want to volunteer, at their children's school. So, these are farm worker parents. Right? So they're not just facing the farm worker issues on the job, but then they're coming home to face these issues in their community. So we're trying to link these various different pieces together and do it from a grassroots to what we call a grass tops level.
And thank you for doing that in those two areas, Santa Barbara and Ventura, which is a very, very rich and diverse agricultural production area. So bringing the social justice elements, the labor, the community into that is really critical, very important. David, how about in your neck of the woods? What are you up to and enjoying?
Well, the way I look at things is that crisis and opportunity kind of go hand in glove. And I think we're at a point where there's incredible opportunity, but also incredible crisis. So I'm a physician, and when I scan the landscape of health in the country, I see a population that's in many ways sicker than it's been in a long time. And the crisis is not just a food system crisis, but it's a crisis of obesity and other disease that's related to the food system. So just throw out a couple of facts. We spend about $170 billion a year just to treat obesity. If you factor in other related chronic diseases, it may be $200 or $300 or $500 billion a year more, okay? Similarly, we've got $26 billion a year to treat antibiotic-resistant infections. That's the crisis. The opportunity for me is that we have millions and millions of people working in health, and they don't see the connections to the food system, but when they are made aware of those connections, they become immediate advocates for the kind of food system that the Institute's interested in creating. And so the challenge and the opportunity for me has been to motivate and mobilize those health professionals, whether you're talking about nurses or psychologists or physicians or anyone, to motivate them. So in the last 3 years at the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, we created something called Healthy Food Action, because in their home organizations, these health professionals haven't really had any umbrella where food was the focus. So we set out to create that umbrella through Healthy Food Action and have used it both to educate and motivate health professionals.
Well, that's a perfect jumping off point for my first really question, David. I want to address it to you, and that is, can you please describe from your field or your work where research has been key to improving a program or a practice or a policy? Because that's what we're going to try to drill down on this afternoon.
Yeah, well, one of the challenges within this medical community is that they're not trained and they don't come to things with a food systems viewpoint. So you've got to kind of figure out a stealth way to get them to think systemically. And so over the last 12 years, one way we've done that is to pick wedge issues and then do our own research. So for example, in 2006, we did a report called Playing Chicken, and it was basically about how most of the poultry in the country is raised on feed with arsenic added to it. And health professionals know that arsenic's not a good thing, so they were quite shocked, as was most of the population, to realize that it was FDA sanctioned to put arsenic into poultry feed. And when we went out and tested fast food and retail chicken and turkey meat, lo and behold, we found that there was arsenic residues in that meat. And so that was a small issue through which we could educate people about the whole system.
And where is that today? Did that research generate a negative response or a positive response?
It generated a lot of attention in 2006. It didn't generate a whole lot of attention, at least publicly, at the Food and Drug Administration. Eventually, in 2012, I believe, they did ask a pharmaceutical company who makes that arsenic in animal feed to voluntarily stop producing one of the arsenic components, and they did so. But it's still not illegal, so if they decide tomorrow to reintroduce it, they could. So just last month, we've actually petitioned the FDA to make those arsenic in chicken feeds illegal.
And what was the purpose of the arsenic addition?
Well, the FDA approves it for things like pigmenting the meat or to make the poultry grow faster. Okay. So it's not an essential thing. And in fact, in the European Union and in many other countries in the world, it's never been approved as safe. Okay. So it's not used there, obviously.
Ernesto, how about you? What do you describe something from your field or work where research has been key to improving a program, a practice, or a policy?
So I can't say for sure that it has, but I would like to focus on participatory action research, which is something that I strive to use in my work. And if you think about it, having a cycle of doing research or finding out information, reflecting, and then taking some action based on the information you found, I've found that working with farmers in using such an approach is this reflection piece that can really lead to learning. Starting with myself as a researcher, I think that reflection piece, when we're talking to farmers about what we've done, about how it can be used for a more tangible benefit or change that can hopefully make their lives better, it has brought two things to me as a researcher. One, it's made me more accountable to not just think about my research objectives, but how is this important to the people that I'm working with, that are the non-research partners. Also to strive to make it more meaningful in a more conscious and explicit way. And I think that from the farmer side, it's the same too, is the notion of using information to make better decisions. And also thinking that they can bring some research questions to the table and say, I am interested in this. And we could probably work together in finding some answers and maybe even finding some actionable solutions if we work together. So I think that practice of reflection, I see a lot of people focusing a lot on the research and the action, but that reflective piece to me is a really important piece of the participatory action research approach that helps a lot of the partners that are involved.
Do you see that occurring at other universities? Have you all seen that in some of the research that you're engaged in? Do you see it around the nation or around the world, this reflective?
Chris Bacon, him and I have been working together for a long time, but he's at Santa Clara. He's doing some of that. Let's see, Steve Gleesman, Miguel. There's a lot of people doing it.
Good. Good. Tracy, how about you answering this question?
Right, so as a journalist, right, like I'm not usually specifically advocating for a policy or a program, and a lot of what frames my work is trying to improve the quality of discussion and debate and building cross-class understanding so that then you can begin to sort of build, I mean, in the back of my head, I'm like, if we can build better communication so that you can start to build enough momentum for political change, right? Like broadening beyond like just sort of like an upper middle class consumer strategy and sort of broadening it beyond that. So for me, what's been the most helpful in my work is good social science on what's actually driving consumer behavior. And so some of that is structural. So it's looking at things like food distribution infrastructure in supermarkets. And so sort of that food desert concept is sort of the first part of that discussion. I think it's a problematic term, but you know, it started a conversation. And then in terms of the personal level, I think some of the research that Patricia was referencing earlier, right, the sort of stuff about, do families really want healthy food? Can they get it? What does that all look like? So sort of food shopping and spending by income class, things like that, it's actually buried back in BLS data and USDA data. That's all super helpful. But as a journalist, right, I'm often doing kind of back of the envelope type of calculations with the research that exists. And so for me, if I can find research that's telling a fuller and better story, and certainly is better social science than what I can do with my back of the envelope, that makes my work much stronger.
As a writer and as a journalist, you must engage in quite a bit of research that is going to impact what you're writing about, impact people's habits, whether it's food purchase or buying or practices from the field. How do you go about doing that?
Well, the kind of research that I do is often fairly immersive. So when I was working on my book project, right, and when I lived and worked in different parts of the food system, right? So, most of the actual reporting I was doing firsthand was just immersive work and going and, getting a job as a farm laborer and living off of my wages and doing that. And even when I'm doing more traditional third person type reporting, my job is to go and talk to people about what their experiences are, getting their stories and doing very careful note taking and sort of crafting a narrative, and then finding social science that can actually help me understand what I'm seeing on the ground and framing that. Because all the stuff about sort of how different income classes are shopping, I just spend lots of time calling academics and on Google and trying to figure out, is there any data that at all describes this? And figuring it out that way.
Great, thank you. Maricela, how would you answer this question?
So, as I said earlier, from the very beginning, research was absolutely critical to our work to give us legitimacy. So often at the grassroots level, when you have, a nonprofit, intermediary organization, quote unquote grassroots folks who come in, wanting, to change policy, living wage, healthcare access, food access, it's really easy, for school board members and city council members to discount the community, even if they come in large numbers, and especially when you're working in a, relatively conservative area, to be completely invalidated as, those bleeding heart liberals. And so research has been, front and center or at the core or, part of our arsenal, along with our leadership development and community organizing. And I think the good news is that there are just, a variety, sort of a menu of ways that research can assist, and sometimes it's very easy. So when we did the living wage effort, we had a student intern from the UCLA Labor Center, who actually did, a summer project on what would be the impact in the city if this living wage ordinance passed. So, that could be done by an intern. To just partnering with a grassroots organization and just having, a professor, on as a list, on the list of authors, and or possible, just having the university logo, something like that, which is not very intensive because, in those cases, we often did the research ourselves, secondary research ourselves, and the professor or the institution was, more kind of in an advisory capacity, so it really didn't take a lot of effort on their part. And yet at the community level, when you walk in and you have farm workers meeting for the first time with a city council member, a school board member, when they're handing this report to their representative, and they see along with the logo of CAUSE is the logo of UCLA or UCSB or USC, that automatically gives them as farm workers, as community members, the legitimacy of this institution. And it really didn't take a lot of work. The more intensive work is what Ernesto talks about, participatory action research, and we've done that on 2 occasions with UCSB and with USC. And it is more intensive, to get grassroots community members to see that link between the information gathering and how that translates into, some kind of, result down the line is challenging. And so I think that there, nevertheless, the buy-in is in letting them know that they're the experts, that they're the knowledgeable ones, and here are outside professors coming in, and they're there just to facilitate and assist them in documenting their expertise and their knowledge. So it is more intensive in terms of engaging grassroots folks and the time of professors or institution, but it's certainly deeper work that is definitely needed, and it's very transformative for community members. So there's a spectrum, and I think that for a research institute, realizing that there's this spectrum where you can partner and be involved in social change at a grassroots level that can fit your needs as a researcher, but can also respond to an immediate policy social change on the ground.
Have you experienced success with the participatory research approach? Has it been?
So with the 2 research pieces, one of them was resulted, actually, it led to our developing our Centro Mujer. We have a CAUSE Centro Mujer, and that was, a participatory action research that involved farm worker women. And, one of the results of that was, we don't have a public space where we can come together and develop our skills and talk about our issues and be part of the community as a leader. And so our Centro Mujer came out of that participatory action research, and it exists today, and it's still a place where we gather and take action from there. Another is with Dr. Manuel Pastor, who I think is, from our perspective, just an excellent expert, I think, in linking high-level research to the grassroots and doing it from a local to a national stage. We did an environmental justice participatory action research there, where they did their own environmental mapping, and that was part of our effort in organizing around against Halico, which is a Superfund site, and against defeating liquefied natural gas proposal off our coast that would have impacted the farm worker and immigrant community. So we've definitely had success with it.
And June, you and I were talking about your work from The Hague to the Philippines to China. What would you say from your experience in reflecting on a more global situation on this question?
I'll
You're good.
reflect more on the ongoing research around global land grabbing, but in more general terms, not any specific research, because this process would tell us a lot about many of the items that are for discussion today. Well, that's one of the fastest growth areas of research in the academia today, the global land grabbing research. I think there are close to 1,000 PhD dissertation projects around that, broadly cast. But anyways, it's fascinating. But it's a case where, there's not been any concrete improvement, or not yet, in terms of policies. If at all, maybe the situation is even getting worse each day. But the positive thing is that this research collectively has impacted in a very positive way in terms of the cross-sectoral understanding about this phenomenon, the character and trajectories of the land grab phenomenon worldwide. And it was not started with the academics. It was the civil society organizations, particularly the report by a small NGO based in Barcelona, GRAIN, in 2008 that jump-started everything. Followed, of course, very closely by a number of very influential media reports. And then policy experts followed closely. And then much later, the academics followed. But when they eventually joined forces together, it was much more productive. The overall impact of this is that they were able to put this burning issue onto the official agendas of powerful bodies like the United Nations. So suddenly you have the UN Committee for Food Security taking seriously the issue of global land grabs. I think next month or the month after that, G8 is taking seriously the issue of land grabs. Of course, we know that putting an issue onto the official agenda is one thing, effecting actual change is another thing. But most importantly, I think what the global land grab research collectively would show us is that it has emphasized the issue of interconnectedness in our current world today. And this can be seen in three important ways. One is that it's impossible to talk about food without talking about land. How do you do that? Unless you somewhere else, not using natural way of growing food. So land politics is so central to food politics. Yeah. And that's what this land grab research has shown. Whether it doesn't matter whether you are concerned about Mozambique or in Europe, or for that matter, I think in the United States, it's the same fundamental questions. I think comrades from Detroit already emphasized that. How do you even talk about urban food gardening if you don't have control over the most important factor of production, which is land? But what is emphasized here is between land grabs and the rise of flex crops is the interconnections between land, food, feed, fuel, carbon, finance. It's the convergence of multiple crises that put the revaluation of land at the very center stage of development policy discourses. Yeah. And that's, I think the land grab research during the past 5 years has put that very forcefully, that connection. The second way of looking at the interconnections is that it's impossible to talk about food just in the context of agriculture and rural. In a planet that is very much very urban now. There are more people now who consume food who do not produce food. So eventually we talk a lot about linkages, agriculture, non-agricultural, rural, urban. And again, many of these land grabs that are occurring are being done in and around urban spaces and in the name of urban interests. Then finally, I think it shows the land grab literature research has forced us to think that the interconnection between the global south north. Whether we are interested about food politics in Oakland or food security in the Gambela region of Ethiopia, we are somehow connected in important ways. And I think those are very important contributions by the very young, emerging research on land grabs, but it also tells us a lot about the tensions and synergies between the different stakeholders. I don't like much that word. Different actors in research, academics, social movements, think tanks, policy experts on this issue as well. That there's always this inherent political tensions and synergies.
Thank you. I haven't heard it as clearly and precisely articulated as you just did it. Before we move on to my next question, does anybody want to jump in on that one? It's such an important one. I know we'll probably deal with it in the breakout sessions, but I learned a lot in the last minute or two there. That was fantastic. Okay, next question. Now this is open forum, you guys. You can all jump in. The question is, can you point to specific gaps where research has been or would have been helpful in moving a policy, a program, or a set of goals forward, or an example where research was not as helpful as it ought to have been, and why? Specific gaps where research has been or would have been helpful in moving a policy forward.
So I'll go ahead and start. I think something that Ben said earlier struck me, and he framed it in terms of, this work in terms of transforming requires a whole, new mindset. And when we're doing this work, we rarely find research that that exists that is from a social, economic, environmental justice lens. It's just not really, out there. And so, there's within the food system, there's very little research, on farm workers, relatively speaking. So that is very, problematic because our experience is that, especially on tough issues, so let's take the issue of pesticides. Farm workers, are right there. They're breathing it, they're, handling it. Think about farm worker women, pregnant, they're just so directly impacted. We know it's a poison. We know physically and to our soil. Whatever little reform we try to pass is thwarted even by folks that we would think are our natural allies. So, the Dems, Latino legislators. And so we, as an example, we went to the state capitol and we were advocating for, what I would consider just, you could barely call it reform, a little tweak to an existing bill that would, have an impact on pesticide mitigation. And we had this newspaper article and research where they had actually just recently, found that there are impacts on gestational, pesticide levels within the mother, and 5 years later, in terms of the learning ability of children. And it was long-term research, very hard science, and it meant nothing. It meant nothing to the legislators. I mean, the two people that voted it, essentially, voted it down was, the Latino chair of the Democratic caucus, or the chair of the Latino caucus, was one of the nay votes. Another urban Asian progressive woman voted it down. And so when we're in those situations, and we take the time to bring farm worker people up to Sacramento, which is very difficult to do, and you've got these 1, 2, 3, if that, research reports that are available in terms of farm worker communities. It's just not enough to, unfortunately, to push legislators, given the corporate and industrial ag power. And so, having research that's looking at, marginalized communities and the impact of this failing food system, on them, sometimes it's just a matter of how much research is out there, right? And when there's so limited research, then, it just fails. So I think that there's just huge gaps, again, looking at it from the perspective of the voices of, in order to empower marginalized communities and see them as leaders, not the problem, but also, to make our case when we know we're up against corporate interests that have a huge impact.
When you were speaking about those very specific issues, my mind was thinking about what is the relationship between research and science. I always think that research is science, and we all know that we can use science to back up a number of our beliefs. So in the issues that you were just addressing, was there a difference between science and research in terms of demonstrating that a pesticide is having this impact and therefore we need to change the legislation?
I mean, in that case, I think that's such a poignant example because, this was scientific research. I mean, they had taken the blood and urine samples, of women, over, from the time they were pregnant, and then, followed them through to, the time that their kid was, a kindergartner. So how much, harder science can you get than blood work, urine tests, and following them through, the same group. So, and yet, it wasn't enough. Right. It wasn't enough, and folks that we would think are our allies, weren't there because we're up against powerful interests that they're able to they've got muscle, and so we've got to build our muscle, and it comes in different forms, and one of those is just the amount of research that exists.
How about other gaps, other experiences that you've had? Jump on in, and June? You're good.
Not exactly gap, but it's more of some problems or tensions in actual research that could lead or have led to some missed opportunities. And again, I come back to where I'm coming from, which is on land grab research. And there are two most common problematic extremes in the range of in the actual land grab research today. One is an action research driven with a very strong sense of political urgency that we have to do something about what's going on. Peasants are being expelled from their lands as we speak, and we need to do something. It's not just we are not interested in a post-mortem research, as one activist would put it. We want to understand and change as we try to understand or prevent peasants from getting expelled as we try to study why they are getting expelled. It's a fantastic framing. It's the most important framing. But many of this kind of work, if done and when done in a very careless way, can actually undermine the political potential of advocacy work. And the land grabs literature is littered with this kind of problem at the moment. Like each NGO would try to outbeat the other one in terms of coming up with the biggest number of estimate of how much lands already were grabbed by whom and everything. And without even explaining how they define land grab, or without even explaining how they come up with methodology. And they come up with very problematic cases. Like, I come from the Philippines, and my work on the Philippines for the past 25 years is on land issues. And the Philippines is among the most popularly reported country in the world today as having been grabbed to a large extent. They said 5 million hectares of lands in the Philippines were already grabbed by foreigners. That's more than half of the total agricultural land of the country. Wow. I go around and I could hardly find a proper case, straightforward case of a land grab. They have been reporting like newspaper reported based initial discussions way back in 2006, but in 2007 it was already totally abandoned. But then 2012, they still got into a global database. This kind of polluted data with, of course, a great political instinct and a great political objective of emphasizing the gravity of the problem. I can sympathize with that. But this is where a careful research is important, because that should not justify cutting corners in doing research. The sense of political urgency does not justify anyone in cutting corners in doing good research. But the other type is where many academics are guilty. Post-mortem research. They want to understand in a very step-by-step, very careful way of analyzing what happened. What happened here? Why were the peasants who were violently dispossessed and dropped somewhere else like chickens, you know? But it's after the fact. There's nothing more to do to change the world in favor of poor people. So in between these two extremes, I think the main challenge, and that's a gap at the moment still, although there are some modest initiatives to try to marry the sense of urgency of campaigners and advocates in this working on this issue, and the rigor of the academic community. Marrying them together, it's not easy, of course. It's very difficult. It remains an important gap. It's being filled in bits, a little bit each day, but it's still a long way to go.
Yeah. So June, your own investigation, your own observation in your own country of the Philippines demonstrated that those research about the amount of grabbing was not accurate.
In the Philippines and elsewhere,
Yeah.
it's not just in the Philippines. In my research in Mozambique, in Mali, in Cambodia, in Burma, in China, it's well, maybe China is more or less the more accurate even reporting. 40 million families suffered land expropriation during the past few years. On average, 80,000 individual land conflicts occur each year, and all these things. I think they're even much more accurate in their reporting. But the land grab literature would not even consider the Chinese internal land grabbing as part of the land grabs, nor the internal land grabs occurring in India in special economic zones. So there's a lot of confusion about what to count and how to count.
Yeah.
And that leads also to our confused understanding of the character and trajectory of capital accumulation, which is, in the end, the broader context within which all this specific resource conflict occur.
Okay. Other thoughts on this issue of specific gaps? Yeah.
So I can draw a parallel with
Ernesto.
agroecology, with my field, and we had our questions sent before a couple weeks ago, like you guys were very organized. This was a two-part question, and the second part was an example where research was not as helpful as it ought to have been, and why. And to me, we're talking about a food system that is broken, and we're talking about a type of agriculture, industrialized agriculture, that is largely responsible for this, right? So there's been billions of dollars invested in this type of agriculture that have not been invested in agroecological research. Mm-hmm. And more specifically, there's a huge gap on taking on participatory research, actionable research with small-scale farmers. Mm-hmm. They have been ignored by industrialized agriculture. So there's millions of farmers. We've heard today from Olivier, these farmers are producing most of our food, yet to do long-term research that could lead to improving the way they farm, improving their food sovereignty, improving their livelihoods, there's very little. And there, as an academic in a U.S. university, it's not easy to get funding to do that. Yeah. So, that is one of the things that I hope that an institute like this can address too, is how can we advocate for resources to do this type of research, rigorous research, but that is accompanying very specifically a set of stakeholders that need it, that are important in the food system and have been largely ignored.
Good. Anybody else want to weigh in? David?
I think a lot of the individual disciplines represented here have their own blind spots in terms of science and how they look at science. So for example, even though the major challenges now in public health and in medicine are challenges of systems, chronic disease and food-related challenges or climate change, we still come at things with this idea that there ought to be a single cause and a single effect. So it's really it's based on the model of an infectious disease or a bug, where a single bug causes a single problem. So what's the solution? Take the right drug and voila, the problem disappears. That model does not work for broken food systems or for climate change or any of these other very complex issues. Similarly, in our legal system, it views science in a very particular way. And I'm no lawyer, but as I understand it, the burden in the courts is often on demonstrating a cause and effect relationship. Very difficult to do if you're trying to deal with these same sorts of systems issues. Now, as a counterpoint, we've got people here, agroecologists or evolutionary biologists. They, I think, often do develop very important scientific findings, but they're not necessarily findings that fit within the paradigms of these other disciplines. And so, for example, somebody like Ignacio Chapela, might come at things from a microbial ecology point of view, and that point of view could be out there for 20, 30, 40 years, but in medicine, we're just coming around to the fact that, hey, the bacterial gut flora might actually be important for health, and how does, right? It's only taken decades, but how does that then, I think that the systems challenge is, how do we find ways to talk about soil health and human gut health using the same frame? That's where things really get interesting and exciting, but we got a long ways to go.
Cover cropping. Tracy, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I would just say, I'm sort of the odd one out here in that, I'm just sort of very, very focused on what are individual people doing and eating, and for me, better research around the class dimensions of how the food system works, even at the consumer end, would be really powerful because, food writing traditionally, like people that write about food, it traditionally has been this sort of gourmand, elite, sort of trade that people go and they do this because, you love food and whatnot. And so most of the stories that we've had about food and the people that have become experts at writing about it come from those backgrounds. And I think what has ended up happening is there's this sense that to write about food or to care about food, you must look like the people that are writing about food and come from that same background. And that's certainly, as we move towards this discussion of food as much more of a human right and as something that we all deserve to have access to good quality of, right? It's really easy to shoot down any effort to make change if you can say, but it's only like rich, upper middle class white people that care about that, right? And so the framing and the narrative that we have is really important. And so the more that you can develop research that really sort of breaks down, like, look, on average, Americans spend, I think the most recent numbers were like 12 or 13% of their income on food, but that would be, the third of the US that's in a household over 70 grand a year spends 8%, and the third that's below, I think it's 25 or 35,000 is the cutoff, is more like a quarter to 35% of their income on food. That's a really different problem when you're talking to the low-income families than when you're talking to the upper-income families. Right. So the more that research can be out there with that in mind, I think that's really powerful.
And that does get to this next question, which is how can research results be translated or communicated more effectively into policies and practices on the ground, and what hurdles are there for that to happen? So how can research results be translated or communicated more effectively? Any thoughts on that?
On two things. One, on translation into policy reforms, for example. The difficulty when we talk about public policy, then we automatically necessarily talk about the state. Well, in the context of land grabs or for food in general, is that the state has always this contradictory role to task to perform all the time. One is to facilitate capital accumulation. On most occasions in land grab sites, it's the state that actually facilitate or even actually do the actual land grabbing. But at the same time, the state has always had to maintain a historically determined minimum level of political legitimacy. So it's this difficult balancing act between capital accumulation and political legitimacy that allows for the limits and possibilities of political reforms to be realized. And I think it would always be important to embed our discussion on policy reforms within that context about the character of the state, at least in the context of flex grabs and land grabs globally, that is very much so. In the context of communicating research outcomes, I think the more effective way of doing that, I think a collaborative knowledge production is the surest way to a democratic knowledge sharing, knowledge dissemination, when we are all together here from the very beginning, it's not just the experts doing something and then giving it down, or also not the other way around. I'm more of an advocate of a sandwich strategy, a little bit from below, a little bit from above. I think this is more of the sandwich strategy by USC Professor Jonathan Fox.
I like that a lot. Other thoughts on this question about translation, communication? David?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions, and to my mind, one of the challenges we have is when we think about communicating research outcomes and talk about it that way, it implies that we only think about communication after the outcomes. And I think much more important is to think about the framing, not only of the research, but of the questions at the front end of the process. And so to my mind, there's three questions in there. One is, who's asking the questions? And the previous panel talked a little bit about this. If the community involved is involved with framing the question, you end up with different questions as well as different outcomes.
Yeah, good point.
And they're immediately more relevant to that community. Two, I think we often implicitly think that the best translators of the research are the people doing the research. And one of the lessons from climate change over the last 15, 20 years is that that's not always the case. And we need to be much smarter about who is the best messenger for the message that needs to be communicated to policymakers and others. And then three, I think there needs to be investment on the research side into how to talk about research. So framing research. And there's been, I know, for example, the Kellogg Foundation for years put quite an investment into how to talk about food systems. And there are others in the room who could probably correct me, but I think that was a step in the right direction, but there is much more that could be done in terms of how do we talk about what we know or what we'd like to know.
Great. Anybody else want to tackle that?
So I'll talk about the hurdles. So I agree with both of you. But the big hurdle is this type of research that from the onset it wants to translate both to policy and on the ground is a lot harder. And the three things you mentioned are not easy to do. So we go back to the question of resources and support. And to me, that's one of the biggest hurdles is, and again, I'm localizing myself as a US academic, that's not what my department necessarily wants me to do. They don't want me to spend 5 years with coffee farmers to help them be food sovereign. They want papers in academic journals. So how do we actually get to that and find more support for this kind of research that takes longer, is harder, might need non-faculty staff because of what you just said. Like you need a facilitator sometimes. You need someone who's really good with community members or communicating with policy members. And one of the things that came up in our breakout session was that a lot of the times universities form these advisory councils for institutes such as this one, and that they have no power, right? So they might have representation from citizens, from farmers, from stakeholders. They don't really change. So, but there were also examples about how you can insert some community engagement into research institutes where those advisors, those board or executive committees could be, like the one that was used here. I can't remember, it was in Minnesota, example from University of Minnesota, where when they wanted to cut a sustainable agriculture institute at the university, that group of people was able to advocate really strongly with the legislator to avoid it. So forming these partnerships to try to get more support for this I think is really key.
Critical. Great.
In terms of translating research, so I mean, there's the research that's done, I think, in collaboration and relationship, where, as was said before, there's a lot of trust that needs to be built and just relationships, period, between the research community and the community on the ground. If you're doing it in partnership, then it's that sandwich or it's that dialogue, and so you're not doing it in a vacuum on either end, but you're inherently in dialogue and figuring out together what's the best question and how to best frame it and put it together. So there's I think that dialogue and that partnership gets at both the communication up front as well as how are we going to use this research and communicate it to policymakers. The other that I just think is just really, really important, I was really glad to hear in the first panel, and that I just want to speak to. So more often than not, the research is going to happen absent the community. Because we're all, rooted and grounded where we are, and community-based organizations are, in the community, and researchers are in the institute, right? So, so that's where, again, I think that for the research to be applicable, to be meaningful to the community, researchers really have to, I think, adopt core and front and center is that race, gender, class lens. And from the get-go, to be thinking about whatever it is that they're researching, from that perspective. Otherwise, it won't speak to the community. Our system is such that it's, the public is predominantly, at this point, people of color and low income and women without the access to the food. And so if researchers aren't using that as their premise from the get-go, then it's going to be ever so hard, if at all, to translate that research into something meaningful for change, for transformation.
Well, one of the things at our lunch breakout was said that maybe this institute could really, really bolster and encourage cooperative extension. And I remember I wasn't raised as a farmer. My mom and dad weren't farmers. I didn't marry the daughter of a farmer. So I came to it through a circuitous route, and cooperative extension was the channel, the tunnel of information, along with my fellow farmers. Because we all swap and share stories, and how do you do this? What piece of equipment do you do that with? But it was cooperative extension. If we could bolster that system, at least as one of the outcomes of this great institute, That would be very significant. I kind of hear that from you all. Well, I want to thank the coordinators and the organizers of this event. These panels have been very rich for me. I've learned so much. You all coming from around the world, from across the nation, bringing your ideas. I can't think of a better way to stimulate our next breakout session. And let's go.
Great. I want to thank the panel for holding down that horrible spot after lunch. It's the worst panel spot. When you ever draw that, you're like, oh, God, the post-lunch spot. And also for helping us narrow what we're going to do next, which is focus on the research agenda, a little bit more specific. I bet that you all are so good at what you do because you have good pattern recognition, so you've probably figured out what to do with your little codes on your name tag. And what to do next is to go to the color or number at the bottom. I'm going to remind you of the colors and numbers real quick, or the colors. If you have a red dot on the bottom, you're in 102, blue is 104, yellow is 203, and green is 204. And one more thing, if you find yourself in this room in a group that's 5 or fewer, I want you to absorb yourselves into other groups, preferably the ones outside of this room in the small breakout rooms so that we don't have too small circles. Last thing, finish and be back in here at 4. All right, for the listeners' report. Thank you.